Ed Gein's mother, Augusta, died in 1945, and 2 years later, he says he began digging up graves. But how did he escalate to murder? Well, that's what we're going to be getting into in this second part. In 1957, November 16th, Bernice Worden disappears from the hardware store that she owned and operated in Plainfield, Wisconsin. And pretty soon after, authorities were tipped off that Ed Gein was the last person that she spoke with. He had indicated to Bernice's son that he wanted to buy antifreeze, and then the last receipt that she'd written at the store was antifreeze. So they were tipped off to him pretty much right away. And what we were saying before we came back was there wasn't really much of an investigation, because as soon as they went to go check out Ed Gein, well, it became pretty obvious that he had done it.
Yeah, he wasn't even sly.
Yeah, you walk into Ed Gein's house and you have walked into Ed Gein's house.
Yeah, and it's a little strange to me how it got to the point where he was able to have so many of the items that we're gonna unfortunately get into. You guys, I always say, you guys know this show. This is about murder with friends. If you were going to be shocked, don't watch.
Right.
In any case, they come to his apartment, and what they find, and I'm going to read all this stuff out. They find 4 noses, whole human bones and fragments, 9 masks of human skin, bowls made from human skulls, 10 female heads with the tops sawed off, human skin covering several chair seats, Mary Hogan's head in a paper bag, Bernice Worden's head in a burlap sack, 9 vulvas in a shoebox, skulls on his bedpost, organs in the refrigerator, a pair of lips on a drawstring for a window shade, a belt made from human female nipples, a lampshade made from the skin from a human face. And hope you weren't eating. Interestingly enough, these artifacts, once they were found and they were photographed by the crime lab, they were all immediately destroyed.
Yes.
Yep.
I'm not familiar with protocol. It seems like, I guess,
In rural Wisconsin, was there protocol for this sort of thing?
Yeah, in the 1950s. I think even they were like, you know what, these are desecrated human bodies. Let's maybe not.
And they could at least discern that the 2 corpses that were not just from a grave, from someone that had already died, Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden. So they knew that he'd really only killed 2 people, and then it was up to them to sort of match up which graves he had robbed. And he said he only robbed about 9 graves, even though he says that he dug up to 40 in a days. So I'm wondering, is that sort of a psychosis or a mental break?
Well, if it's a blur for him, he's probably not going to be keeping a very, precise count of how many,
And I think that's what's frustrating with Ed Gein. He's not a bright guy, but what he was able to construct, given his background in, carpentry, and he was definitely from a family of the land, he was able to make these very intricate designs that might indicate to someone that he was a little bit more maniacal than he really was. He was a simple guy. He wasn't very smart. And so the answers that law enforcement were looking for, they weren't getting.
No.
They weren't there.
He knew how to tan hides,
I would call him obsessive, but not theatrical. And in spite of the fact that, the list of things you just read sounds like a horror movie set designer's, dream project. He wasn't, how you hear about like the Zodiac killer and they're taunting the public.
Right.
They're hoping people come to them and hunt for them and see everything they've done. The BTK guy, same deal. With Ed Gein, it was very much I'm hiding in my little house and this is my project and no one knows.
It's
and
my property.
I won't talk about it to anybody. I won't make a show of it. Neighbors come over sometimes and see the things and he says, "Oh, war souvenirs."
Oh yeah, he claimed that he had shrunken heads from the Philippines that were World War II souvenirs. And again, I mean, the death of Bernice happened because he claims he picked up a rifle in the hardware store and it went off and shot her. And so again, it could have been very a possibility that Ed Gein could have gotten away with all this stuff in his house, and that no one would have noticed until he had just died one day, and weeks passed by, and some neighbor was concerned and checked and opened the door, and was.
Had he been an inch more clever?
If he hadn't, you're saying if he had not killed Bernice, because Mary Hogan would disappeared in 1954.
Right, but nobody
put it
connected
together.
that to him. Yeah.
Right, but Bernice was the one that they connected to him because it was so sloppy. I guess we can speculate it probably was not planned. This wasn't a guy that put extreme amounts of thought or care into his crimes. But I think that's a really good point. If he hadn't killed Bernice Worden, we probably never would have heard.
This would have been a posthumous discovery.
Yeah,
this guy had done all this stuff, but nobody knew about it until he died because he'd kept it so quiet.
Yeah, Alonso, in part one, you touched a little bit on the suit that he was constructing and what that connection was to his mother. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, again, you talk about how it's hard not to think about Mrs. Bates. It's also hard not to think about Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, but it has been theorized by, forensic psychiatrists or people sort of trying to establish motive after the fact, this notion of him trying to create this suit of female skin that would allow him to become his mother. Maybe not all the time, but to sort of occupy that space and bring her back in a weird sort of way,
And I also read a report that while his house was sort of in disarray, kind of like a hoarder mixed with human flesh, and also weird animals, because he was a hunter as well, his mother's room from when she passed away was largely untouched.
Right.
Locked away, yeah.
That to me is so eerie. That for some reason
It's a shrine, right?
Yeah. It's even creepier just because it does play out like a horror movie as we understand today, but he set the tone for that. That wasn't someone's idea before. That was purely him, which is just so completely disturbing for me. So while his crimes were sensational and they made national headlines and his car was toured around the country sort of like an exhibit,
Yeah.
almost like a little bit like the traveling
That's
circus.
so weird.
I mean, he was sort of a freak show.
Yeah.
Right.
His trial itself was actually pretty mundane. It was pretty ordinary because he confessed to everything.
Yeah.
He was an open book.
Did you do it? Yep. I mean, that's the end. Yeah.
That's the end of it. But the big question surrounding his trial was whether or not he was legally insane or if he was competent to stand trial. Because when we say that Ed Gein was a simple guy, I kind of feel like that's understating how slow he really comes across when you see him. This is not a bright guy. No. But in 1968, he was ruled to stand trial for the murder of Bernice Worden. And I have a clip of exactly how that went down. Let's take a look.
In 1968, Gein's doctors wrote a letter to the court stating that Gein was now competent to stand trial for the murder of Bernice Worden.
When he walked into the courtroom, there was dead silence. It was just, you could hear a pin drop. And then he walked in and he stopped a little bit and he bowed his head to the audience.
After a 9-day trial, the judge found him guilty. The 62-year-old was sent back to Central State to live out the rest of his days. In time, Ed Gein's macabre fame would fade, yet his twisted saga would never lose its capacity to shock or its power to provoke our deepest fears.
So he ends up dying of complications due to cancer in July of 1984. And whenever we cover serial killers who kind of had a long life behind bars, I feel a little strange about it. Ed Gein's a little different. He wasn't really a serial killer. He was, I think, very clearly a sick man. But it still feels a little strange. I'm not an advocate for the death penalty, and so whenever we come to this portion of the end of someone's life, with Eileen Wuornos or whomever, I always feel strange because I'm not really sure what resolution I want.
Sure, especially when they have better health care than so many of us.
Well,
Weirdly enough, but no, I mean, what I get out of Gein's life is, you can have whatever your feelings are about religion, be they pro or con, there are times when sort of a fanatical brand of religion can really feed into a very specific pathology and create a circumstance where maybe somebody who already had issues with women or issues with, kind of violence or fitting in or whatever, then has this added kind of imprimatur of like, oh, it's in the Bible, that just snowballs out of control.
Yeah, and I think also his story is a combination of indoctrinated guilt and shame, because she was quoting the Old Testament. Now I'm a Christian and I hate, and the Old Testament hates me, and as a gay person, and then also I really don't like the Old Testament. I also love being out in the open when I'm on my period and not in capes. Like there's so much to the Old Testament that we could be shamed for.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting that Augusta Gein focused on that, the shame and not the love. And so that's why I think that this is a very interesting example of religion being used as a tool to keep someone down, to keep an already dumb kid really under her fist. You know?
Well, it's that thing of whatever it is that you're trying to make someone else do, or that you want to make a mass of people do. You can find something in the Bible that will back you up on it.
Yeah, and that's sort of what we see from Augusta Gein, and I never want to blame a crime on someone else, but Ed Gein, I think the reason why he did capture the public attention was because he raises these questions of guilt. How guilty should he feel? Like, was it, given how he was raised?
I think that the mental illness factor involved. Is he guilty of these actions? Yes, he is. Mm-hmm.
Are these actions deplorable? Yes, they are.
Were they under his control?
Yes. Dave, I think that's what it is.
And his crimes have resonated throughout history. You may not know his name, but you know the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and you know Silence of the Lambs, and you know Psycho.
Oh.
And so, and all of those three cultural products are the result of Ed Gein's existence. And so, the weird thing about especially Psycho, you're horrified by it, as you are horrified by Ed Gein, but simultaneously, I think of all the most popular 20th century serial killers, he's the most pitiable.
Yeah.
He's the one that you maybe almost feel sorry for.
Mm-hmm. There's a compassion elicited there that you don't get in other
I think
cases.
that's the feeling I'm wrestling with as I sit here. It's the compassion that I feel for him that I definitely don't feel for his mother. And it's that duality where then I'm questioning, okay, who's to blame here? Obviously it's Ed Gein, but she has to share some of that.
And that's why
I do think that she was so influential in creating who Ed Gein became.
And because there's no resolution to that, it becomes something ultimately that we're not going to get closure with. It is sometimes ultimately unknowable. And the unknown is what makes people afraid.
Yeah, and oh my gosh, I love this segue because when we come back, we're going to be talking about the movies that Ed Gein inspired that make us afraid and that made you afraid. So we'll see you then on Murder with Friends.